I want to tell you about the exact moment my mother finally looked at me like I mattered. It didn't happen after a graduation, or a promotion, or any of the milestones people normally celebrate. It happened after I lied. For most of my life, I was the invisible kid. I learned early how to take up less space, how to speak only when spoken to, and how to celebrate quietly so I wouldn't inconvenience anyone. When I did well in school, it was expected. When I struggled, it was ignored. Other people's problems were always louder than mine, and my mother seemed to orbit those crises like they were gravity itself. By the time Christmas came that year, we hadn't really talked in months. Maybe years, depending on how you define a conversation. We exchanged updates, not feelings. Information, not care. I told myself I was fine with that, even though part of me still hoped she might notice the distance and ask why it existed. She never did. I drove to her house that afternoon with my hands tied on the steering wheel, rehearsing nothing and everything at the same time. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I wasn't planning revenge. I was just tired. Tired of being overlooked. Tired of shrinking. Tired of feeling like my life only mattered when it was useful to someone else. Dinner was exactly what you'd expect. Familiar smells. Familiar jokes. Familiar roles everyone slipped back into without thinking. I took my usual seat, the one slightly outside the center of things, and listened as conversations flowed around me. No one asked much about my life. They never really did. As plates were passed and glasses filled, something in me shifted. It wasn't anger exactly. It was clarity. I realized that if I stayed silent, nothing would change. If I told the truth, it would probably be dismissed like everything else. And in that moment, I made a decision that surprised even me. When there was a brief lull at the table, I spoke up. My voice sounded calm, almost casual. I said I had sold my company. I added a number so large it felt unreal even as I said it. $150 million. The effect was instant. Forks paused midair. Conversations collapsed into silence. Someone laughed, thinking it was a joke, then stopped when I didn't. I felt every eye in the room move toward me, like a spotlight snapping on without warning, and then my mother looked at me. Really looked at me. Not through me. Not past me. At me. Her expression changed in a way I had waited my whole life to see. Interest. Surprise. Attention. It landed heavy in my chest, equal parts validation and dread. In that frozen moment, memories rushed and uninvited. Every missed call. Every achievement reduced to a nod. Every time I convinced myself independence was strength, not survival. I could feel the younger version of me standing somewhere behind my chair, watching to see what happened next, hoping this time would be different. The room felt warmer, louder, closer, and I suddenly understood how quickly power shifts when perception changes. I wasn't proud of the lie, but I couldn't ignore what it revealed. Money, even imaginary money, had weight. It bent the air. It bent people. And as my mother leaned forward, asking questions she'd never asked before, I realized this Christmas had already crossed a line there was no going back from. I realized, all at once, that nothing about me had changed except the story I told. And that realization scared me more than the lie itself. It felt thrilling and terrifying, because in that silence, with everyone watching, I understood something I hadn't before, didn't know yet how dangerous her attention could be. Before that Christmas, my identity had been shaped more by absence than by attention. I grew up in a house where love felt conditional, measured by usefulness, obedience, and timing. If I was needed, I was acknowledged. If I wasn't, I faded into the background. I learned early not to ask for much, because asking usually led to disappointment or irritation. My mother was physically present but emotionally unreachable. She was always managing some crisis, often one she chose, and I learned that urgency elsewhere mattered more than quiet consistency with me. She could be warm to others, animated and engaged, but with me she seemed distracted, as if I were a task she planned to return to later. Later rarely came. At school, I did well. Not perfectly, but well enough to be proud of. I brought home report cards, awards, and stories I hoped might spark something meaningful. They were met with nods, brief comments, or comparisons to someone else's bigger success. Over time, I stopped presenting my achievements. It hurt less to keep them private than to watch them shrink under indifference. As I got older, I started building small side projects. Nothing flashy, just ideas that interested me and gave me a sense of control. I worked quietly, teaching myself skills, failing in private, improving without witnesses. It wasn't confidence driving me. It was necessity. I learned that if I wanted something done or protected, I had to handle it myself. Invisibility slowly became routine. Routine became emotional distance. I stopped explaining my choices because no one listened long enough to understand them. Conversations stayed shallow, focused on logistics and surface updates. I told myself this was maturity, that independence meant not needing validation. But the truth was more complicated. Some part of me still waited for approval I pretended not to want. I imagined what it would feel like if my mother asked real questions, or expressed pride without conditions attached. I hated that part of myself for hoping, yet I couldn't silence it. That contradiction followed me into adulthood, unresolved and heavy. Christmas had a way of reopening wounds I thought were healed. The company I mentioned at dinner that night wasn't imaginary. It was just inconveniently real. I had built it quietly over years, in fragments of time most people never notice. Late nights after work. Early mornings before anyone else was awake. Weekends that blurred together while the rest of the world rested. There were no announcements, no launch parties, no social media countdowns. Just steady effort layered on top of exhaustion. It started small, almost accidentally. I noticed a problem I understood better than most, one I kept running into myself. Instead of complaining about it, I tried to solve it. At first, it was barely a business. It was an idea taped together with trial and error. But the more I worked on it, the more it made sense. I refined it quietly, improving pieces no one else could see. I never told my mother about it. Not because it was a secret, but because history had taught me better. Every time I shared good news growing up, it was met with dismissal or comparison. Someone else had done more. Someone else had done it faster. I learned that progress became smaller once it was spoken out loud. So I kept mine private. As months turned into years, the company grew slowly. There were setbacks I didn't admit to anyone. Days when nothing worked. Weeks when money felt tight. Moments when I wondered if I was wasting time chasing something no one believed in. I funded it myself, piece by piece, reinvesting whatever I earned back into the work. There was no safety net. No applause to keep me going when motivation dipped. What surprised me most wasn't how hard it was, but how much discipline it demanded. I learned to separate emotion from execution. To show up even when no one cared. To keep going without reassurance. Somewhere along the way, that discipline turned into emotional detachment. Not just from the work, but from family approval altogether. By the time the company became profitable, I was used to celebrating alone. Wins felt quieter than I expected. I would sit with the numbers, acknowledge them internally, and move on to the next problem. There was pride, but it was contained. Private. Safe from being diminished. So when I lied at Christmas, it wasn't about greed or showing off. It wasn't even about money. It was an experiment. I wanted to see if success, even exaggerated success, would finally make me visible. I wanted to know if the story mattered more than the substance. Didn't expect how fast the energy in the room would change. After the words left my mouth, my mother transformed in ways that felt deeply unsettling. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was subtle, almost practiced. Her tone softened first, losing the sharp efficiency I was used to. Then her posture shifted, leaning toward me instead of away. Questions followed, replacing indifference almost instantly. Real questions. About my life. My work. My future. For the first time I could remember, she wanted details. Not updates she could summarize later, but specifics. How long had I been working on it? What did the company actually do? What were my plans now? Each question landed like proof of something I'd always suspected but never wanted confirmed. Around the table, the rest of the family reacted too. Relatives who barely remembered my birthday suddenly leaned in, eyes bright, voices animated. It felt less like curiosity and more like opportunity. Like investors sensing potential. Compliments arrived awkwardly, stacked on top of each other, as if they'd been saved up and rushed out all at once. Someone said they always knew I'd do something big. Another said they weren't surprised at all. I almost laughed at the revisionist history. I smiled. I answered carefully. I kept my voice even. Inside, I was doing mental math, not about money, but about meaning. Nothing about me had changed except the number I claimed. Same personality. Same work ethic. Same person sitting in the same chair. Yet the room treated me like a discovery. That realization hurt more than I expected. It confirmed a truth I had avoided for years. I wasn't invisible because I lacked value. I was invisible because my value hadn't benefited anyone before. Attention, I realized, wasn't given freely. It was activated. As the evening went on, the questions shifted into assumptions. Suggestions turned into plans. Someone joked about future vacations. Someone else mentioned investments they wished they'd made earlier. My mother spoke about we instead of you, looping herself into decisions I hadn't invited her into. Boundaries blurred in real time, replaced by entitlement disguised as pride, felt powerful in a way I never had before, but it wasn't clean power. It came with tension. With unease. With the sense that something fragile had been disturbed. I drove home that night replaying conversations, recognizing patterns, and realizing the lie had unlocked a door I might not be able to close easily. The calls started the very next morning. Once the story settled in, my phone stopped feeling like a tool and started feeling like a liability. It buzzed constantly, lighting up my pocket with names I hadn't heard from in years. My mother called daily. Sometimes her voice was sweet, almost nostalgic, like she was trying to recover lost time. Other times it was urgent, clipped, wrapped in anxiety that didn't quite belong to me. No matter the tone, every conversation orbited money without ever naming it directly. She framed things carefully. First as advice, reminding me to be smart and careful. Then as concern, warning me about people who might take advantage of me. Finally as obligation, suggesting responsibilities I apparently had now that I was so successful. Each phase slid into the next without pause, like a rehearsed progression. I found myself exhausted after every call, replaying sentences to identify where the shift had happened. Extended family followed quickly. Cousins, uncles, people who had never asked about my work before suddenly wanted to talk. Each conversation revealed how fast people assign ownership over success they never supported. Suggestions turned into expectations. Curiosity turned into entitlement. I realized my lie hadn't just changed how they saw me. It had created a version of me they felt qualified to manage. Every boundary I tried to set was treated like arrogance or betrayal. If I said no, I was reminded of sacrifices I hadn't asked for. Old memories were rewritten in real time. Small gestures from years ago were reframed as investments in my future wealth. I was told I owed people without ever agreeing to the debt. The emotional manipulation was subtle but relentless, dressed up as family unity and concern. The attention that once felt validating now felt invasive. I wasn't being seen as a person. I was being evaluated as a resource. I felt reduced to potential, stripped of context and autonomy. The most painful part was recognizing how easily love had been replaced with expectation. Pride came with conditions. Interest came with demands. I started letting calls go to voicemail. I delayed responses. I needed space to think, to breathe, to feel like myself again. Instead of easing the pressure, my silence amplified it. Messages grew longer. Tones sharpened. I was accused of changing, of becoming distant, of forgetting where I came from. Silence, it turned out, provoked them more than honesty ever did. When I decided to gather proof, instead of confronting anyone directly, I did something that felt quieter but far more powerful. I started documenting everything. Every message that came in. Every voicemail. Every carefully worded request that pretended not to be a demand. I didn't announce it. I didn't threaten anyone. I just saved things. Methodically. Calmly. At first, it felt unnecessary, almost dramatic. Then patterns began to emerge. I could see emotional pivots in real time. Sweet encouragement turning into urgency. Concern turning into pressure. Pride turning into expectation. When I lined everything up, the shift was impossible to ignore, went further back than recent messages. I reread old emails. I remembered childhood moments I had brushed aside. Missed milestones. Conditional praise. Attention that appeared only when something could be gained. I realized I had been living inside a long-running pattern, not a sudden change. Christmas hadn't created it. It had just exposed it. I built a timeline. On one side, years of indifference. On the other, immediate interest the moment money entered the story. The contrast was undeniable. Seeing it laid out stripped away doubt. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't being sensitive. The data spoke clearly. I also organized the real story of my company. Actual revenue. Growth charts. Contracts. Legal structure. Everything grounded in facts, not fantasy. Preparing it felt strange, like assembling proof for a trial that might never happen. But it reminded me of something important. My success was real, even if the number I'd used was exaggerated. I had built something solid. Something legitimate. That realization steadied me. I wasn't preparing to expose anyone publicly. I wasn't collecting evidence for revenge. I was protecting myself. For the first time, I wasn't reacting emotionally to pressure or guilt. I was thinking strategically. The more evidence I gathered, the calmer I felt. Anxiety loosened its grip. Confusion faded. Control returned, not through wealth, but through clarity. I understood exactly what I was dealing with and why it hurt so much. Clarity replaced hope, and strangely, that felt like relief. I realized I didn't owe anyone explanations. I didn't owe speeches or defenses or emotional labor. What I owed myself were boundaries backed by facts. Boundaries I could hold without wavering. Boundaries that didn't require permission, and for the first time, I felt ready to enforce them, but then an unexpected twist forced my hand. The twist didn't come from my mother. It came from the truth catching up to my lie. A few days after Christmas, I saw a congratulatory post tagged with my name. A mutual contact had publicly praised my mother on my supposed sale, referencing deal terms and timelines that never existed. My stomach dropped as I read it. The story was no longer contained inside private family conversations. It was spiraling outward, picking up details like debris as it moved. That moment forced me to face something I had been avoiding. Lies don't stay small when other people start benefiting from them. They grow. They adapt. They invite attention I never asked for. Pause. I realized I had underestimated how quickly the narrative could escape me, especially once pride and reputation became attached to it. That's when my mother called. Her voice wasn't worried about me. It was tight with panic, sharp around the edges. She asked why people were talking, what exactly had been shared, and who might be watching. There was no concern about my stress, my boundaries, or the pressure I'd been under. Only fear of embarrassment and exposure. I didn't interrupt her. I let the silence stretch between her sentences. I listened as she worried about appearances, reputation, and access. She talked about how this could make her look foolish, how others might question her credibility, how doors could close if the story unraveled. In that moment, something settled inside me with painful clarity. I saw exactly who she was protecting, and it wasn't me. As she spoke, memories surfaced. Times I had needed support and been told to handle it myself. Moments I had shared progress and watched her lose interest. I realized this conversation wasn't new. It was just louder and harder to ignore. When she finally paused, I spoke calmly. I told her the number wasn't real. I said it plainly, without drama or apology. I explained that the company existed, that it was growing steadily, and that should have been enough all along. I waited for a response that never came. The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was calculation. I could almost hear the mental math. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask why I felt invisible for so long. She didn't ask what had pushed me there. Instead, she immediately shifted into problem-solving mode, asking how we could manage the narrative and control the fallout. That shift told me everything. It confirmed that my feelings were secondary to optics. That my honesty mattered less than convenience. I felt an unexpected calm settle in my chest, not relief, but certainty. I understood I could no longer fix this from inside the relationship. Whatever came next would require distance, intention, and resolve. That was the moment the last thread snapped. I stopped seeking emotional resolution. I stopped hoping for understanding or accountability. I saw the relationship clearly for what it was, stripped of illusion and expectation. The lie had done its job. It revealed the truth I needed to see. And now, it was time to end the experiment on my terms, even if it meant everything would change for good. I knew that ending it wouldn't be quiet. It would ripple outward, unsettling the balance everyone had grown comfortable with. Still, the clarity was undeniable. I couldn't unknow what I had learned. I couldn't pretend the lie was the problem anymore. The real issue had always been the conditions attached to love and attention. Ending the experiment meant choosing myself, even if it cost me familiar roles and fragile peace. I took a breath and accepted the discomfort ahead. Growth, I realized, rarely feels gentle in the moment. It feels like loss before it feels like freedom. Ending it would change everything. I braced myself for what separation would reveal, knowing distance would expose truths I had avoided. The next steps would demand discipline, patience, and boundaries stronger than guilt. I was ready. Ending it would change everything, but staying silent would have changed me. I chose the harder path because it was honest. That decision marked the true midpoint of my story. Ending it would change everything. Forever onward, I stepped back deliberately, not in anger, not dramatically, but with intention. I reduced contact first, answering fewer calls and taking longer to respond. I didn't explain myself every time. I didn't announce a break. I simply stopped being available on demand. That alone shifted the dynamic more than any argument ever had. When I did speak, I clarified boundaries once. Calmly. Without emotion. I said financial discussions were off limits. My work was no longer open for commentary, advice, or planning conversations. I didn't justify those decisions or soften them with apologies. I stated them as facts and moved on. Then I stopped repeating myself. Silence became my reinforcement. Predictably, this triggered anger disguised as disappointment. I was told I had changed. That success had made me cold. That family was supposed to share everything. I recognized the script instantly. I didn't argue with it. I didn't defend myself against it. I simply didn't engage. Instead, I redirected my energy. I focused on expanding my real company, the one that existed regardless of who approved of it. I spent time refining systems, strengthening partnerships, and building something sustainable. I also invested in friendships that felt mutual, relationships where support didn't come with strings attached. The contrast was stark and healing, creating distance from emotional volatility felt strange at first. The quiet was unfamiliar. There were moments when the absence of constant tension felt almost wrong, like I was forgetting something important. But slowly, that quiet turned into peace. And that peace became addictive. For the first time, my success belonged entirely to me. It wasn't observed, evaluated, or contested. There were no expectations attached to it beyond my own. I noticed how much lighter my decisions felt without anticipating reactions or managing feelings that weren't mine to carry, when I understood something I'd never been taught. Boundaries aren't punishments. They're filters. The people who respected them stayed. The ones who didn't revealed themselves fully. No confrontation required. No speeches necessary. Behavior did the sorting for me. I didn't announce my exit or dramatize it. I didn't give ultimatums or demand understanding. I simply removed access. Calls went unanswered. Invitations were declined politely. Conversations stayed surface level when they happened at all. That quiet decision reshaped my life more than any dramatic confrontation could have. Independence, I learned, is loud only to those losing control. To everyone else, it looks like calm. Like consistency. Like someone no longer negotiating their worth. I felt steadier than I ever had, even as I sensed something unresolved building on the other side of that distance, because boundaries don't end stories. They change how consequences arrive. And I could feel them moving closer. The consequences arrived anyway, without access to my time or the imagined wealth that had triggered so much attention. The dynamic shifted again. Slowly at first. My mother's calls grew less frequent, each one lighter, less urgent, more perfunctory. Then they stopped entirely. The family narrative began to rewrite itself in subtle ways. I was no longer the invisible child, but I wasn't the celebrated success either. I became something in between, a cautionary tale, a story whispered with judgment rather than admiration. I let it happen, feeling neither the need to correct it nor the urge to defend myself. Meanwhile, my real company continued growing, crossing milestones I had once considered impossible. Each achievement came without expectation, without judgment, without someone else claiming a stake. Opportunities arrived from outside the family system, earned entirely through my effort and skill. There was no emotional debt attached, no strings hidden in compliments or advice. The irony was clear: the less I chased validation, the more grounded my life became. Karma didn't look like revenge. It didn't arrive as punishment or confrontation. It looked like absence. The people who ignored me when I had nothing lost access when I finally had something worth protecting. That absence carried weight. It was sharp in its silence, undeniable in its finality. There was grief in realizing how conditional care had always been, how little it had ever belonged to me. But alongside that grief came relief. I no longer carried the burden of trying to change someone who had never been capable of it. I stopped asking what I could have done differently. I stopped wondering why recognition never came when I had earned it. I accepted that some things were never mine to fix, some attention was never mine to earn. I focused instead on the tangible, the measurable, and the lasting, the work I had built, the relationships that were mutual, the boundaries that protected me. Success didn't heal the relationship. It didn't erase old neglect or rewrite past silences. But it did heal my self-respect. That was a quiet, powerful victory I hadn't anticipated. I could enjoy accomplishments without fear, without apology, without strings attached. Every milestone, every small win, felt sweeter because it belonged entirely to me, and in that clarity, I understood the final lesson: love that arrives late, or conditional attention, cannot replace the satisfaction of standing on your own terms. I had finally claimed the authority over my life that had been denied to me for so long. And that turned out to be the most valuable return of all. One final conversation remained unresolved. Months later, my mother reached out one last time. It wasn't to reconnect in the way people imagine. There were no warm inquiries about my life or expressions of pride. It was a test, a small probe to see whether the door I had closed was still ajar. I noticed the pause between her words, the carefulness in tone, the hesitation that carried unspoken expectations. I answered honestly, without hostility. I told her that I no longer measured my worth through her attention. That my life was full and peaceful without constant evaluation or commentary. I said that I appreciated the instinct to check in, but my boundaries weren't negotiable. She didn't argue. She didn't try to persuade me. She went quiet. And that silence, unlike past silences, felt different. It was final in a way I could accept, steady in its distance, and clear in its intention. I didn't get an apology. I didn't get the emotional closure I had once hoped for from her. But I got something more powerful, closure on my own terms. I could let go of resentment without needing validation or acknowledgement. I could carry my accomplishments without being weighed by someone else's standards. Looking back, the lie I told at Christmas wasn't about money at all. It was about visibility, about proving to myself that being seen could happen even if temporarily, when the rules of attention were finally challenged. It revealed exactly how conditional love operates. It showed me why boundaries matter more than approval, and why controlling your narrative matters even more than others' perception of it. If you're building something quietly, in silence, and feeling unseen, know this: being ignored doesn't mean you're insignificant. Often, it means you are growing beyond the environment that can recognize you. Your progress may be invisible to those who have never celebrated your worth, but that doesn't lessen its value. Sometimes the people who fail to notice are simply unable to see that. And why question for you is simple. If your success suddenly made people notice you, would that attention feel like love, or like a warning? Think about it carefully. And consider where your attention truly belongs, on those who nurture it, or on your own growth that cannot be borrowed. The truth is, the life you create in silence is more powerful than any recognition you chase. And sometimes, the people who finally notice are no longer the people you need. That is both the lesson and the freedom.